One of the ideas that I wanted to expand on is this idea of Jesus being the disciple of John the Baptist, and John the Baptist actually being Jesus's rabbi. It's kind of an outlandish idea if you think of it just on the surface. So, well, Jesus didn't have a rabbi. Well, actually, in order to become a rabbi, you had to have this authority placed upon you. And we talk about, oh, yeah, well, everybody saw the dove come down. Well, the text actually says that John was the only one who saw the dove come down. And we don't know who heard God say, "This is my beloved son, whom I am well pleased in." But let's assume it's only John. And maybe after this baptism, John places his hands upon Jesus and passes the shmicha onto him. It's that idea that John had been mentoring Jesus all along. Maybe in the same way of, you get your son out on the basketball court and play with him. And you realize early on that you are going to be well outmatched by your son in just a couple of years. I remember my dad was a good high school athlete, but at 5'10", growing up in central Illinois in a farm town, he did not have the opportunities that some of my brothers and I had. And as we grew and were suddenly all over 6 feet tall, and a couple of my brothers are like 6'3", 6'4", my dad knew that his ceiling would be the floor that we all jumped off on. And, we all wound up having great basketball careers. And I would say that John knew Jesus was going to be this better basketball player than he was. And yet, in this sense, we're actually talking about like this expanse of the kingdom, this theology, this explosion of the kingdom of God coming. John was there to prepare the way. John was the tutor. John was the one who helped him with his memorization of the Torah. John was the one who helped him understand the Psalms. John was the one who probably taught him many of the parables. John was this rabbi who was the rebel, who was in the desert, who was his cousin. Like they had blood relationships, so it would make sense that Jesus would study under him. And John, being a gifted son of the man who was in line to become the chief priest, he would have had at his disposal texts that are just hard to come by. I mean, the reason you memorize the text is so that not everybody had the same text in their town. And it's really important that you would be able to call up from memory these pieces. I think it's amazing that Jesus walks in, it's not in Mark, but he walks into the synagogue and he opens up the scroll, and the first thing he opens is that beautiful piece from Isaiah. And, the odds that your synagogue would have a scroll of Isaiah are pretty slim. There just weren't a ton of copies. It wasn't like you just had 8 copies of the Bible sitting on your phone. It was just a different day. And so I really like this idea about John being his rabbi. I like it because it takes us to a real place in time. It gives us real context for how Jesus became this incredible teacher. He was crafted into something. Sometimes we just have this vision that Jesus just showed up as a 33-year-old rabbi and instantly had power. No, he grew as a young man. Like it says that he grew in wisdom and he grew in relationship with God and man. Like he grew up, he learned these things, and he had to have teachers. Joseph would not have been qualified to teach him these things. And even I think about this idea of him sneaking into the temple and debating with these religious scholars at age 12. Of course he's doing that. That's what little rabbis do. Of course he is. He's doing that with John all the time, and maybe even Zechariah. So I really like that idea. I also really love this idea around Jesus calling his disciples. First, we often think of these disciples as grown men who are in their mid to late 20s, who come around this 33-year-old man who's kind of got this like bravado about him, right? We're going to go follow this guy. He's just a couple of years older than us, and we are going to do this. And yet, really what history tells us is these were young kids. These were 12, 14, 16-year-old boys, maybe 18 at the oldest, which is Peter. But these are kids. And their lifelong ambition is to be accepted into rabbi school. Like their idea of getting to be with a rabbi is like the penultimate transformation of their childhood. They all had memorized Torah. And maybe these guys, maybe Peter and Andrew and James and John, maybe these guys just weren't good enough to memorize it in the ways that we think you had to have it memorized. Maybe they themselves had disqualified themselves. Yeah, I'm just not good enough. You know what? My dad owns a fishing boat and I'm going to become a fisherman. And here's these 12, 13, 14-year-old kids out fishing. They're doing their thing. And yet all the while, I think in their heart, they're longing to do what they know as the ultimate rock star position of their day, which is to serve in the temple of the Most High God. The one God worthy of worship. They just weren't quite qualified. And I think oftentimes we do the same thing in our own lives. We disqualify ourselves because we don't have all our theology worked out, or we don't have our understanding of this passage worked out, or we can't defend our faith, or, put 1,000 different reasons as to why we can't be the believer that we want to be. Disqualify yourself however you like. And yet Jesus turns to him and says, hey, you little boy right there, you with the net and the fishing pole and that kid throwing worms in the pool, you guys, come on. I want you to be my disciples. And in an instant, everything changed. And I think the message for us to internalize is that Jesus calls you regardless of your qualifications. There doesn't have to be a level of maturity to be a follower of Christ. The maturity happens during the process. You have to grow. In the same sense that Jesus grew and learned, so did these guys. The example of, should we call down fire and brimstone on this place that kind of is mad at you and was disrespectful to us? No. We have to learn how to control these things. It's not about retribution. It's about mercy. I'm here to usher in a new way. That's an old paradigm where we would burn the people against us. I'm here because there's a new way. I am the gateway to mercy. I am the gateway to this brand new thing, and it's going to cost me suffering to usher this in, but I'm going to show you this new way. And so we see these guys learning. We see Jesus taking time to teach. You think about Peter. Peter denies him 3 times. Peter gets told to get behind him because he's voicing the thoughts of what Jesus refers to as Satan. And he just says, was Satan in Peter? No, but did Peter kind of come out of it from a personal view? Of course, that was Peter's context. And yet Jesus lovingly brings him back and teaches him and brings him into the fold. I have to think of when these kids were called, it was like this. It was like they won the lottery. It was as if these kids were suddenly drafted onto an NBA basketball team and they had only ever played in the YMCA. They never went to college. They never had draft workouts. They never had any of these things. Jesus looked at them and said, there is so much potential in you that I want to take you now. I want you to be part of my team. I want you to be part of my family. And I think that's the invitation to us right now, is that Jesus is calling all of us, that none of us are disqualified. And it doesn't matter what you've done. It doesn't even matter what you'll do. It matters that Jesus is calling you, and will you accept that invitation to follow him and to go after what he has in store for us? I think this is a teaching point. I think it's really pertinent when you look at these guys in Mark. All these Christians are suffering, and yet they read this and they see, oh yeah, Jesus called everyone. He called the least, he called the great ones, he called us all. And I think there's a moment in there where you grasp onto it and you're like, okay, in spite of my suffering, I still remember that I am called. And I think that's the piece that's woven through Mark. And I'm so impressed at the depth of research that men and women have spent their entire lives looking into this so that we can benefit from these ideas. We can look at them and say, oh, this is not just a simple gospel. This is written with a complex narrative of ideas, and it's written in such a way to convey a message to people who are in the middle of suffering. And I think that's the power of this entire Gospel of Mark, that the author has done a phenomenal job of reminding everyone that they are worthy and they are called to follow the confident yet suffering rabbi.